Hello and welcome back, and you know what, that's quite a bold statement right out the gate. If you've clicked on this video, chances are you've done so because of the big glossy thumbnail or the title that basically said, this is the most powerful 2-bay I've ever seen. And I'll be straight with you, I can back that claim up. But right now, in the world of network attached storage, I think most users, especially myself that's been wading through this for years, would say that when it comes to the hardware architecture of your average turnkey NAS system, remember, turnkey, that'll come up later on, very important. When it comes to the turnkey solutions, generally 2-bays kind of get the old Evo when it comes to the hardware specs. A lot of brands will look at 2-bay systems and go, well, there's not much point over-speccing this. There ain't much point, pimping this bad boy up because you've only got 2 drives of storage to play with. So you don't have a huge amount of storage potential in terms of network bandwidth you're going to be able to fully saturate. On top of that, when you've got 2 storage drives, traditionally a lot of NAS drives are going to be built utilising the optimization of hard drives rather than SSDs because of the larger capacity versus price point compared with that of SSDs. And the result is that beefing up a NAS storage system, at least with regards to most turnkey NAS systems, it seems like a bit of a waste of time giving it a huge amount of power under the bonnet because you're not really going to have the storage potential to take advantage of it. However, in recent years, we have seen things change significantly in terms of the average hardware of systems, with a lot of more compact NAS solutions not only taking advantage of more powerful and higher performing SSDs in the M2 NVMe bracket with Gen 3, Gen 4 making itself well established and Gen 5 already starting to leak its way onto the scene. But on top of that, we are seeing better and more comprehensive and efficient cooling systems being built into these more compact models. And all of that has been adding up, after this long intro, to more compact NAS systems that are now able to utilize higher performance components inside, which is where this puppy comes in. This is the Aoostar R7. Now, we already reviewed the Aoostar R1 a little while ago. That was an Intel N100 model of this. This is its bigger brother. Now, I say bigger brother, it's identical, right? If you watch that video, this looks pretty much the same, and indeed it's not until you strip it apart and indeed when you log in on BIOS that you actually see the main differences. This device rocking out the gate at between $299 and $429 depending on which configuration you go for. So the $299 has got no internal SSD, no memory, but if you go for $359 you get 16 gig of memory and a half a TB SSD with the OS on board, and if you go for $429, you get a 1 TB internal SSD and 32 gig of DDR4 3200 MHz non-ECC memory included inside there. Now, the SSD inside, I will straight away say, it's not some lovely third-party or open-source NAS OS. This isn't your UnRAID, it isn't your true NAS, it isn't even your OMV. This is rocking out the gate with Windows 11. Not server, not any kind of mad network attached storage version. That's just Windows 11, and that is because Aoostar is predominantly, up until recently, a mini PC brand. There's lots of them out there. We've talked about several on the channel before, and Aoostar, this is, I would argue, the second leg in what is turning into a 4 or 5 system rollout in the next 12 months in terms of NAS. They've got a 4-bay on the ropes, and there is a beefier combined 6 NVMe and 6 hard drive model in development right now, but I think we're not going to see that for a few months. But this device is one of their 2-bay NASs that have arrived on the scene, and this system rocking out the gate with an 8-core CPU and support of that insane amount of memory and a couple of M2 NVMe slots inside, technically making it a 4-bay. No, forget it. This is a 4-bay. We can't do that. Get rid of the strip. This 2-bay NAS is another system that's into the growing area between turnkey NAS solutions from brands like Synology, QNAP, Aoostar and TerraMaster, and full DIY build-it-yourself open-source solutions like TrueNAS. This is filling that middle ground for users that want pre-made NAS solutions, so they don't want to muck around getting it done. They want it affordably, but they also want the option to stick on their third-party software, which, frankly, everyone that buys this, including myself, who is going to be testing this with UnRAID later in the video, is going to just go ahead and stick a third-party OS on there. Everyone's going to junk that Windows 11 update on there, or the Windows 11 OS. No one's going to use that on this. Anyway, that's enough about that device and why it's important to the industry. You came to this video to find out more about it, so let's talk about the design. If you're coming to this video off the back of my Aoostar R1 review, you can skip ahead on the design because frankly this is identical in terms of its design, its scale, and pretty much all the ports and connections that we'll touch on later on. So you can skip ahead to the hardware section of the video and the performance bit if you choose. But for the rest of you, the system, I would argue, stylized, not dissimilar to that of the data transporter or some of those big kind of blocky Mac devices have passed. This device here rocking out at 16.2 by 16.2 by 19.8 centimeters in size and arriving at about a kilo in weight depending on the storage media you use inside. It arrives with a 90-watt external PSU, not USB-C, something we moaned about in the previous video, which is a bit annoying there. But I will say, with the device arriving, well, at least that external power brick, it makes it pretty much identical to every other 2-bay that I've talked about on the past here on the channel. Indeed, when you compare it against, and I did this before, comparing that size of this 2-bay versus other 2-bays currently in the market, I would argue, although it seems like it's taller, if you put it down on its side, you'll see that the system is pretty much identical in scale and size to other 2-bays in the market. They've just gone a different way in terms of what they've got in their available volume there. The stand-up tower model of this, it's got a base level fan. It's a 90mm PC fan based in there, and there's an additional CPU fan with attached heatsink inside that we'll talk about later on. There's no ventilation on the sides of this. There's a single LED power button there, and on the top we have got a ventilation panel there that can be easily removed, and then inside there we've got the two individual 3.5-inch SATA bays inside, additional ventilation around them, and you can just make out, more on that later on, that CPU heatsink attached to the fan there on their larger scale cooler. But overall, from what I'm seeing in terms of design, I liked it when I talked about the R1, and I like the design that we're seeing here. I think it's very petite. We did noise testing in that other video, so we're not going to repeat the noise testing here, but if you check out the R1 video, we did some noise testing of booting with and without drives. Because again, even though it arrives with those SATA drives inside, because it arrives with an SSD in most cases, depending on the configuration you go for, you can theoretically run this on just a baseline SSD that's included inside it there. But overall, I like the design, I like the ventilation, I liked it on the R1. The only real complaint I can come up with is that power supply there not being a USB Type-C as we're moving towards that. I can understand the use of an external chunkier brick and the need for a connection like that if this was a 4, 5, or perhaps even a 6-bay, but at a 2-bay, even with that CPU inside, which by the way has scalable power, this doesn't need, I would argue, 90 watts of power. There's no upgradable PCIe slot inside here. Everything is prefixed with the exception of obviously the removable memory and the drives inside. But a lot of work has clearly gone into this device, keeping it as efficient and scalable as possible. And thanks to that CPU, you know, at the BIOS level, giving you the option to flex it for between 10 to 15 to 25 TDP when needed, this isn't going to be a system that needs a tremendous power draw. And I think within that scope, USB Type-C would have made a lot more sense there. But apart from that, I like the design. So let's crack on and talk about the ports and connections on this device and how it compares with other 2-bays in the market. Returning to my Johnny Big Bananas title on this video being the most powerful 2-bay I've ever talked about, I would say with this, in terms of ports and connections, there is one glaring omission on this. Now, if we look at the rear of it here, we have got 4 USB Type A ports here. 2 of them are USB 3.2 Gen 2, so that's 10 gigabits per second. And we've got 2 standard USB 2 ports there for a KVM setup. Additionally, we have got ourselves an HDMI 2.0 and a DisplayPort 1.4 4K 60 frames per second connections there, which again, what we need if we want to access that Windows 11 software, or if we were going to use a third-party NAS OS, and of course if we want to get into BIOS, more on that later on. There's also an additional USB Type-C port there, standard USB, and next to it we have ourselves a mini SD card slot. Now it would have been great if that was a full-scale SD card slot, but at least it has an SD card slot there, something for us to take advantage of. Now, we're getting to the bit where I've got a bit of a problem with this. At the bottom, we have got 2 times 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports near. So, great. Each one of those ports, theoretically, between 250 and 279 megabytes per second, and with the use of link aggregation port trunking or SMB multi-channel, you can get that to around 550, maybe even 579, 580 megabytes per second on a good day with the right data and the right transmission. But remember I talked about earlier in the video about one of the reasons a lot of NAS providers on their 2 bays play a little safe, because until recently there wasn't the means to really get good bandwidth and get good potential out of something like this. That is not true of this device. And this device arriving with that, again, we'll talk about later, 8-core processor there. This system arriving with M2 NVMe slots inside, 2 of them, I should say. Again, 4 bays, not a 2 bay technically. That means that this system can definitely oversaturate those connections. That means that those network connections have suddenly gone from, oh, we've got loads of bandwidth to play with, to suddenly bottleneck. Now, again, at this price point from $299 to $429, I get it. They've had to really narrow things down. Additionally, there aren't a lot of motherboards out there, particularly when you go custom, like these are utilizing those micro boards. This isn't even MITX, this is way smaller than that. The result is that very few of those boards have 10G on there. You would need it loaded onto a separate card, something that I think in this chassis, this framework, and the allocation of those lanes would be very, very difficult to do. Nevertheless, we've seen it done, and I think this device arriving out the gate with those 2 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports, well, we've seen brands like TerraMaster rock out 2 and 4 bay Intel older gen Celeron processor NASs out there that have got 10G soldered on the board. The F2422, if I remember that correctly, look it up. It is a 10GBE 2 bay out there. The fact this doesn't have it kind of bums me out, and I'd almost say that I would have relinquished one of the M2 NVMe slots inside if they could have made it have 10GBE. There are even M2 to 10GBE developed adapters now that we have seen. This has been something that InnoDisk, I believe, worked on a while ago, and this is something that has rolled out generally to now the ability to add 10GBE via an M.2 available slot, something they could have harnessed in this system. And again, further to that, when I was talking about those other 2 NAS brands earlier on, Synology, again, in terms of ports and connections, this thing absolutely destroys that in terms of ports and connectivity. That's not Synology's bag. That's not their main focus. QNAP, on the other hand, it's more of an even Stevens thing, because this system has those 2 times 2.5 GBE. This system has the 10 GBE USB ports. It has a 4K HDMI output. What it also has, there at the top, is a PCIe upgrade slot. This is a 2 bay that's also got 2 NVMe slots inside as well. This is another technical 4 bay, but it has a PCIe slot there, a Gen 3 times 2 PCIe slot, which shows it's possible, which means that this, as much as I like those ports and connections, the fact that I don't have 10 GBE on it, which inherently means I'm going to have bottlenecks in terms of external network connectivity, is something of a bummer to me. Also, and I've not really touched on this, is this device also has Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth on it as well. Now, as a mini PC, kind of makes sense. It runs on an AX adapter. If I got on my notes, the AX200NGW M2 Intel adapter there, and it's got 2 antennae that run to either side at the base of this system. Great stuff. Now, when you're using your third-party NAS OS, because again, you're gonna elbow that Windows 11 software, it's going to be a question mark how much you can take advantage of that. Now, in a later video coming up soon, I am going to be putting Proxmox on this and running both TrueNAS, Scale, and running OpenWRT on this system to see if it all runs together, and to make sure that OpenWRT, maybe pfSense, but I would rather go WRT, or root, if you will. I'm going to hopefully make sure that that can connect to that Wi-Fi 6 connectivity there. That's why I'm not really talking about it a lot, because I think, again, yes, it's available. Yes, you can take advantage of Windows 11. No one's going to use the Windows 11 on this. Therefore, we need to know how much it can be used by those third-party OSs. But apart from that, and apart from that lack of a PCIe bottleneck, the rest of the network connectivity and the general connectivity of this system, I really, really like. And in terms of it being a NAS with the storage drives there, top loaded there, I like it. I like the fact that those drives unlike if you went for a mini PC and started using an external USB enclosure or an eSATA enclosure there, or utilizing some kind of connected device, at least these are directly attached to SATA inside this case, which means that we're going to be able to take advantage of some serious storage on this. So whether it is you're going to use it as a mini PC with a huge amount of storage capabilities, maybe for a retro gaming server, or you're going to run it for what you should be running it as, a gaming PC, a NAS server, I'd say that's pretty good. But for now, let's grab ourselves a screwdriver and see what's inside. Once again, give me the benefit of the doubt. I am going to skip over some small sections of this because a lot of you have already watched my R1 review and I don't want to be too repetitious for you guys. But nevertheless, I do strongly recommend you check that out because we'll talk a lot more about, say, the horrible plastic trays this thing arrives with. Not a fan of those. But it also talks about the ventilation on this, such as that base level panel there that has 4 screws that you comfortably remove. There is the internal fan we mentioned earlier, and it's as straightforward as that. The system comes out as easy as that. Now, if we take a good look at that board, we can make out some lovely things, can't we? Number one, we've got our 2 SODIMM slots here. Those are SODIMM DDR4 3200 supported slots, and those 2 slots there at the base, as I make sure the light in this studio doesn't wreck the day for us. The system arrives with a fantastically generic memory module. If we get that out of there, we can have a little look. This is an ASINT. Never heard of them. And this is a 16 gig 3200 DDR4 module there. Now, popping that to one side, what we also have is that Wi-Fi module that we mentioned earlier on. Just based there in the middle is our Wi-Fi 6 module for Bluetooth as well. And on the base just above the fan, we can make out one antenna there and another antenna there. So again, nicely laid out. They've done a really good job of separating things. Now, when I talked about the R1 model of this running on the M100, I mentioned about how I was kind of curious about heating on this device because we've got that fan, of course, and there at the top we can make out that heatsink there with the fans being fed into. But we also have that additional fan that's feeding directly in to that heatsink there, directly through that channel. And as good as all that sounds, we're talking about an 8-core 16-thread AMD processor. Looking at my notes, the Ryzen 7 5700U arriving at a 1.8 gigahertz clock speed that can be burst up to 4.3 and with onboard Vega graphics. Now, when we make comparisons about integrated graphics on a lot of these NAS solutions, particularly the 2 bays, and the big debate about Celeron getting slightly eked out by some brands, Synology, and a lot of users saying, oh, you should just jump straight to Pentium. A lot of those devices that I've talked about, the integrated graphics that Intel provide on those is somewhere between 350 megahertz with a burst that can go up to 700 or 800 megahertz. I believe the M100's got a slight raise on that. The integrated Vega graphics on this arrive at 1900 megahertz, 1.9 gigahertz graphical integration on this, integrated graphics there. That is monstrous alongside that 8-core 16-thread processor, which means this 2-bay is ripe for VM deployment on a 2-bay NAS. If you can put 32 gig of memory in this and you take advantage of that larger storage and you've got 16 virtual CPUs to play with, hot diggity dog, this is gonna be the most compact powerhouse virtual machine NAS we could ever see for a very long time. But there's still no avoiding. That's a lot to sandwich there in the middle between 2 storage drives there. Those 2 storage drives are ultimately going to create a nice hot pocket for there. Our little Pop-Tart in the middle that is our motherboard. That's a lot of work on the shoulders of that integrated cooling system. So despite the fact we did noise testing in a previous video, I'm willing to bet if you had more than half the resources on this dedicated to VMs in active use, those fans are going to be in overtime. They're going to be working pretty darn hard because that air, remember, this is a vertical cooling device here. That's quite a lot of reliance on that cooling system that's sandwiched between those 2 drives there. Now, the drives themselves aren't going to generate that much heat unless you were going to use, SATA SSDs and, they were going to be running to the walls. And these drives aren't going to generate too much heat, but it's the fact that it's sandwiching between those two that I've got slight concerns over. So we will be taking a look at that temp level later on, and particularly when we do the follow-up video where we're going to go for the deployment of Proxmox on this with some different VMs. Now, another thing worth touching on is right there at the top. You see that M2 NVMe there at the top from a brand that none of us have heard of? Just above there, can you make that out? We've got another M2 NVMe. As discussed, M2 NVMe's on this arrives with 2 out the gate, and if you get it unpopulated, you've got 2 empty slots to play with. That means that you can have that dedicated tiered storage on here to create your hot cold, or even your hot warm cold, if you want to take advantage of 3 drives on there. So overall, in terms of internal hardware, I like what I'm seeing here. I've just got ever so slight reservations about the temperature when this is in use, something we're going to have to investigate there. But for now, what we're going to do is get this put back together, and I'm going to go ahead and stick UnRAID on this bad boy and get a little bit more information about the architecture of this, a lot more out of BIOS, and some of the performance numbers internally. So let's dig a little deeper into this device. I know you're seeing a black screen and a very misty camera here. Unfortunately, the Elgato we normally use for the recordings, I've run out of USB ports. We've got the capture card, we've got the mic, so I will get rid of this camera in a while, but I just wanted to explain why I'm not really on screen that much. But for now, let's boot this device up here and start making our way into BIOS there. We don't know how long it's going to take, and this will give us some understanding about what exactly is going on with that CPU, and hopefully find out more information about some of that power changing there between the two of them, whether it's going to have a nice straightforward control or it's going to have the PPC power performance control, if I remember correctly, just to see if BIOS is going to integrate that in there. But as you can see straight away there on screen, there is our CPU, that Ryzen 5700, and that memory there inside. So again, we've got lovely bits of information. Let's scroll on through. Let's go straight into that CPU configuration there. Oh, and boom, there we go. There's our power state control there. That allows us to flick between each of those individual power consumption modes there. If we make our way in, dig a little deeper into this power configuration itself, again, all fairly standard stuff that you'd expect to BIOS there. And the hardware monitoring there, we can find out more about what's going on with that inside. It's all fairly standard numbers. I won't say it's running too warm. Again, we're not doing very much at the moment, so that wouldn't be a very fair representation of the device. And in terms of the NVMe configuration, we've already installed an additional Seagate Iron Wolf in there, which we're going to be using on that secondary M2 slot for another video coming up. But of course, there is that weirdly unknown ASINT SSD inside there. That's a Gen 3 SSD as well. And that's really it for what's going on inside. We can find out more information about it. Again, all of that network controller stuff there. And the things seem to be pretty well laid out. Don't worry, we're going to get into UnRAID in a moment, where we're going to dig in a little bit deeper into the configuration of this device. But for now, it's pretty much what I would expect. I'll say right now, I can hear a hum there in the background. I'm just going to bring the mic a little closer to it. Now that is that CPU fan. So that CPU fan has definitely perked up a little bit there in the background during the course of going through some of these options, which again, I think it's going to be one of those question marks about this system and temperatures moving long term, moving into the future there. But for now, let's make our way into UnRAID. I've not installed it yet. I've just got UnRAID on that USB. So I'm just going to go ahead and just straight away boot from that USB drive there, and then go straight into this device. It's changed. Let's go to boot override there. And what I'm going to do is just make my way into UnRAID, install UnRAID on this system, and fast forward now and get rid of the camera, get into the UnRAID GUI so we can dig a little bit more into this system and get some performance and also some information there on the intended layout internally. We're going to be looking at the hard drive performance and the SSD performance with any luck. But for now, let's fast forward. Okay, so we're heading into the UnRAID server. Now, I will say we're already using 2 drives and a USB that we already set up, as you can see there, and we've already got the 2 8TBs there alongside that Seagate Iron Wolf SSD. That's going to be the main focus of the performance test later on. The reason being that the hard drives, you know, with all the oil in the world, these are still just SATA hard drives in a SATA-based system that, frankly, you could have run that on a single-core ARM CPU and not get dissimilar performance. If it was a large-scale RAID array, I get it, but I'm going to put the majority of my focus on performance on this device on that SSD there. Now, on the subject of SSDs, if we head over to the dashboard there, I do also want to touch on something else. As you can see from the UnRAID GUI here via the web browser, we've got loads of information about the layout inside there, the architecture, that memory that we've got on there, the network interface, but what we can also see is the temperature of these drives. Now you can ignore the array and the parity and stuff because we're not going to be looking at RAID performance benchmarks. This is not a review of UnRAID and its support of ZFS. This is just about the disks connected to this device and the performance we get from it and the temperature warnings. The reason I want to touch on those is because one of the barriers we've encountered before when we were doing the flash store UnRAID install, the link station, is a lot of temperature warnings, the default temperature warnings of UnRAID seem to be skewed ever so slightly more towards hard drives. And some of the temperatures that, frankly, on a hard drive would be something to worry about, on an SSD are less concerning. But one of the things I will immediately highlight is the fans are on that system. And even then, those are quite warm hard drives. They're not out of this world hot, but I will say 53 degrees for a drive there is a little higher than I might like. It's by no means throttle or bottleneck territory, and you don't really get that with hard drives the way you do with SSDs, but nonetheless it is slightly higher than I think I would like to see on this system, and I think a lot of that has to do with that compact arrangement, that Pop-Tart that we mentioned earlier on of a motherboard. Now if we come out of that there, move away from those drives there, let's hop into the terminal. So on the terminal then, the first thing we want to do is go ahead and find out the architecture of this system. So if I move that slightly to the other side of the screen there, we can find out a little bit more information about our architecture. And what the first thing we want to look at really is the lanes and the speeds that have been afforded to those NVMEs. So if we scroll up here, have a quick look there, we've got our USB controller again. What we're looking for here is our NVMe. I could do a quick search on there, but you know what, we're just going to scroll through because I'm sure there's a number of you that like to read these sorts of things. There we go, there is our Seagate Iron Wolf 520 drive inside there. We can see that we have been, where's the link? It says downgraded, but it's still a width ×4. We're not seeing where it's been downgraded beyond that, but that's still a reasonable amount of speed there being afforded to it on ×4. It's been limited down to 8 gig, so from there, as we can see, pretty much standard. At least we've not been throttled down to ×1, which should at the very least mean we're going to be getting in excess of 1 to 2 gigabytes per second there. It is a single SSD, remember, so we'll have to really hold out. We're going to go for a 1 gig test file there. We're not going to ensure that we use any kind of caching or anything like that in the background. I've got my commands all set up there in the background. So with our caching enabled, let's run our first test. I believe this is our read test. And as we can see here, we're getting 2 gigabytes, so again 2000 or so megabytes per second. That's a 1 gig test file there. So why don't we go ahead and run exactly the same test, but this time we're going to go for that read test, save you guys having to watch me type out these commands, which is always good. And for our write testing there, we can see again pretty good numbers we're seeing there overall. We're getting 2.0, 2.1 in some places. That's not too shabby. Listing the available drives inside this system, we're able to see there's all of our individual drives, and there NVMe 0N1, that is that internal SSD. So let's do a quick test this time of just that internal NVMe that the system arrives with, that kind of unnamed one that we talked about earlier on, but we need to name that. What are we looking at here? We're looking at NVMe 0N1, so let's go ahead and give ourselves that and run that test on that drive there. And again, we're going to see a lower speed there, so obviously we are getting some of the benefits of that faster SSD from Seagate inside there, but it's still not a terrible drive by any stretch of anyone's imagination there. And while we're here, let's run ourselves the other side of the gamut there. Pop that one there. Let's go ahead and change that. I'm going to be going for delete NVMe. And as we can see, not dissimilar results there for the read and write there, without caching enabled, of course, on those drives. So, not out of this world. Clearly we're not getting the full potential Gen 3 3000 megabytes per second out those SSDs, but it's still not terrible. And if one thing I'm to take from this more so than most other things, it is, once again, I'm kind of bummed out about this system having that throttling for 2 times 2.5 GBE on the rear, which is still good, but it's still only 5, on a good day, 580 megabytes per second external throughput. And it's just a shame that this performance that's afforded to us by both that hardware architecture and that those two M2 NVMe base inside is being throttled in that network way externally. Okay, so now that test has concluded, and I know things are a little bit fuzzy here on screen. The two things I want to take away from that test happening. Number one, the score there in the 6,696, I should say, isn't too shabby. I mean, again, we have got comparisons there being made with older generation Intel Core, but it is still worth highlighting that nevertheless, this is still a 2-base system rocking out the gate at about 400 nicker. So I think that's quite a respectable number for what we're seeing there. But moreover, the temperature there, look at that CPU temperature throughout the course of where things are right now. And I think, again, this is where that compact system is coming into play, because those numbers there are not small. And again, of course, we've run a hefty benchmark here, so it has to be understood that, you know, this isn't atypical of its general use. But again, as good as that onboard embedded graphics are, if you are going to be fully fledged maxing them out, whether it is some particularly high-end virtual machines or 4 or even 8K Plex Media server utilization, just keep a lot of these results with regard to the temperatures in mind within that smaller form factor there, because there isn't really any room to add additional cooling systems within this rather compact chassis. And even those hard drives and the way they're sandwiching around just leave me with slight airs of concern. But nevertheless, I don't think any of this undercuts the sheer value for money that we're seeing here. Let's wrap things up. So, what do I think? Well, I stand by the thumbnail and the description. This is by far the most powerful 2-bay turnkey NAS solution. That is a hardware-software combined solution that you can rock out the gate and, you know, deploy day one. I say right now it's the most powerful in the market. And right now, in terms of value for money, it's also by a country mile the best value out there from what I can see. Even if you go for the fully pimped out 32 gig 1TB model, it's incredibly difficult to beat a price tag of a little over $400 for a system with that much hardware under the bonnet. Now, there are going to be users out there watching this that are going to be saying, well, I could build something for that. I could build something for that. And I'm not doubting it. I'm sure in a year or so, there'll be some kind of top-ton board that rocks out the gate on Ali that has this hardware spec, that has a better hardware spec, and maybe you can DIY it to your heart's content. But what I'm saying is, this is turnkey. This is rocking out the gate, and even if you're never going to use that Windows 11 software license, as a predefined, pre-built solution, it is incredibly difficult to get better value for money than this, and I don't think we're going to see a more powerful 2-bay, 4-bay system than this in the next couple of years. And right now, if that's the most important thing to you, you're getting the best hardware, your old PC tinkerer, and your time is worth actual money, that you don't want to get the silicon paste under your fingernails, this is a great choice for you there. Now, is it perfect? Hell no! One, the software, you're going to have to go out of your way to install third-party OS software on this anyway, because you're never going to use that Windows software in a NAS environment. 2, the network bandwidth there are 2 times 2.5 GBE. As good as that sounds with that kind of hardware, it's already a bottleneck. And although internally you can do better than that, externally you are going to be throttled. Yes, you can go ahead and take advantage of adapters, you know, multi-port USB adapters, 5G adapters, you know, knock out some 2.5 GBE adapters if you wish over USB, but still, nevertheless, it still presents a potential bottleneck there for you. And I'm really, really gutted that they didn't rock this out the gate with a single 10 GBE, rock it out the gate with perhaps, you know, a 3x1 PCIe upgrade slot. Maybe get one of those internal M2s, but I can't really fault it beyond that in terms of hardware architecture. That CPU, or that's a 2021, I think Jan 2021 release CPU, is a huge amount of potential hardware at your disposal and a huge amount of power. And for those looking for a particularly powerful but low-scale home lab, and you've been looking at Intel NUCs and going, it's a bit expensive, where are we going to put my hard drives? If that is something you have felt and thought, this is an insanely great alternative to that. It's just a real shocking shame about the external being something of a hampering point with all of that internal hardware at your disposal. But we're going to be doing more with this, because I think this has got too much potential for it to just sit on the shelf with the rest of the crap behind me. I think this needs to be played with. So I'm going to be doing that Proxmox 2OS build on this to take advantage of open source router software and open source NAS software. What other things do you want to see done with this. This is going to be quite the plaything in 2024, and we're going to have a lot of fun pushing this thing to the limit, and also to see if there's a reason why there are no powerful 2-bays like this. Let me know in the comments what your suggestions are. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. There are reviews linked below to not only that review I mentioned earlier on for the R1, but of course the written reviews that should hopefully be done by the time of recording this video for both of those over on NAScompares. Now, if you're on the fence about what you need for your storage, use the free advice section. It's on the right hand side of every page on NAScompares. Fill out your details there. 3 to 5 working days. Me and Eddie will get back to you. It's genuinely free. If you need expedited support, there is expedited support options. I think it's like a tenner or something over on Ko-Fi. You can have a look. Alternatively, you can hire me for a Zoom consultation on there as well. And of course, there is our other platforms such as using our Discord or Ask.NAScompares, our forum. Finally, there is the Inner Circle, and YouTube membership will allow you to access content early, get that expedited support included with it, as well as our monthly Zoom conferences. We talk about storage, talk about new products, stuff that we got coming up on the channel, and of course, do Q&As with the brands as well. We've done a couple of them thus far. I think we've published at least one of them. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.